Merci, Caroline. Bonjour. Good morning, everyone. Before we get started, a huge shout out to Jeff, APF, Paul, and Universities Canada. What an amazing couple of days in Singapore. And a big thank you to all our Canadian colleagues in the room. Our collective presence is such an important signal that Canada is serious about Asia, and the plans to repeat this in 24 months also signal how serious we are. I've been in the region for 2 weeks, beginning with APEC Business Advisory Council meetings in Auckland last week, APF's Asia Business Leaders Advisory Council earlier this week, CIAC, and then heading to Indonesia. This session's theme, major global challenges, geopolitical, economic, and sustainability, has cut across every single meeting I've been in. Asia is essential to Canada's economic future. Our government's unprecedented Indo-Pacific strategy creates a meaningful incentive for our businesses and our post-secondary institutions to get to work to secure Canada's meaningful participation in what is forecast to be 50% of the world's economy by 2040. But here's the thing. In a post-COVID world, the backdrop for this opportunity is incredibly complex. COVID highlighted the vulnerabilities of global supply chains. Remember the early days of the pandemic, the stockpiling of PPE and vaccines. The recent US CHIP Act is also in response to this. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing's $40 billion investment in Arizona, Intel's new chip manufacturing in Ohio is bringing advanced microchips back into the US market so they can avoid supply chain disruptions by having that part of their product line concentrated here in Asia. Climate transition, predicted to be the largest economic transition in history with huge geopolitical headwinds at the moment. Energy supply disruptions are having countries move back onto coal because they can't secure other sources. The growth of food security concerns among global population growth, and the divide between have and have-not countries. Managing the social consequences of these conditions is essential to global stability, and our panel today will highlight areas where Canada can be relevant to the concerns in Asia and in an Asian context. Our format is going to be 2 rounds of questions, followed by 30 minutes of audience Q&A. Let me introduce our panelists. Boy, you need to look at the program for all the details of their amazing accomplishments. Babak, Abbaszadeh, President and CEO, Toronto Centre. Gillian Tan, Chief Sustainability Officer, Monetary Authority of Singapore. Joy Wong, Roz and Ralph Halbert, Professor of Innovation, Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, Vice President International. Do you get any sleep? And Professor at the U of T. 2 hours. Alvin Tan, Head of Asia FX Strategy, RBC Capital Markets. So let's get started. Babak, congratulations, Toronto Centre's 25th anniversary year. As the leader of this globally renowned international capacity building organization for financial regulators, 2 questions. First, what is Toronto Centre's connection to this region? And second, can you show us how you're helping financial regulators address major global challenges and emerging risks?
Thank you very much, Janet. And it's an honor to be here, and kudos to the organizers, a fantastic conference. Over the last couple of days, we've been talking about how Canada needs to show up and be here and participate. Well, I tell you what, we showed up 25 years ago, right in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis. We came here to help. We didn't come here to get anything back. We built very solid relationships. We work on training financial regulators and supervisors on financial stability, without which no amount of trade can take place. But also outside of Singapore, in the region, in the ASEAN area, there's a lot of need for financial inclusion. So we're also helping with all things related to that, including financial literacy and all kinds of different training programs. And you know what? In the proof of the pudding, and we don't want to take all of the credit, but some of the credit is due to us. The 2008 global financial crisis did not feature any of the folks in this region of the world. And the other thing to keep in mind is when you look back at that financial crisis, you remember credit default swaps. Does anyone remember that? Derivatives? Well, those are now replaced by all kinds of AI, cyber risk, digitization, whatnot. Jen talked about climate risk, and it's no longer like an activist issue. It's actually a financial stability and a financial inclusion implication. And what we do here in the region, and when I came here, one of the first things I did, I paid a pilgrimage visit to the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which is our home base here, and we have very good connections and strong connections. I have two senior staff sitting right there, former officials of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and we work with them on various issues. And one more thing to talk about in terms of what we are doing here, a lot of the work that we do, a lot of the training that we do is to look at what is going to be on the horizon. The kind of training that Toronto Centre does is very hands-on. Think of us not as those erudite university professors, and we have a distinguished member here, but we're really like plumbers teaching plumbers in the financial industry, the architecture, understanding how finance works, where the traps are. We do simulations of financial crises around the world. We teach various issues with relation to AML, anti-money laundering and counter-financing of terrorism, and a risk-based approach to supervision. Financial sector regulators and supervisors can never be as knowledgeable as the industry in which they're regulating and supervising, but they can have an industry risk-based approach to it to be able to anticipate the various challenges. Some of the proof in the pudding, we have a former ambassador of Canada in Thailand here, actually back there, Ron Hoffman. Ron shared a story with me. I cleared with him this morning that I could talk about it. When he was the ambassador there, he had a meeting with the governor of Central Bank of Thailand, and turned out that she was actually an alumni of the Toronto Centre. And that helped with the transition of major Canadian banks into the area, into the region, understanding and the knowledge. And also, Jan, when I was working at Sun Life Financial, I remember the former, and Sun Life is a big sponsor here, the former CEO, Don Stewart, talked about how regulation by itself is not an issue, but he wants to see regulatory certainty. He's willing to comply with the toughest regulation in the world. So what we do, we try to create that standard because we teach according to the best international standards that are out there. And normally, I don't get invited to these kind of conferences. So Jeff, thanks for inviting me. We're usually in Basel or some kind of a financial stability board working group, and it's a very different approach. And one more thing I wanted to mention here before I pass on is Gillian Tan is a member of our Securities Advisory Board of Toronto Centre, a very strong contributor. So I guess I'd like to, if I can, declare an honorary Canadian today, right? So, and then one last thing, Jan, I want to put out is, well, actually, let me just stop here before, and then we can follow up later. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. Gillian, congratulations, welcome to Canada. Great to have you here. Gillian, as was mentioned, she's with the Monetary Authority of Singapore, renowned regulatory agency and active member of the Financial Stability Board. As Singapore's integrated financial regulator, what are the main challenges and opportunities you face building your regulatory and supervisory approach to managing environmental risks?
Thanks, Jan, and thanks very much, Babak. Happy to be an honorary Canadian. I think it's one of my favorite countries. Okay, my favorite. And yeah, so it's all good. No, it's a great question, Jan, and I think, this thing about, how the regulatory approach helps manage environmental risks is a great case study for how, regulation can actually be applied to solve some of the most pressing challenges of the day, right? So Babak was mentioning some of that, and I think, we're double-clicking now into the climate crisis, which, as Jan said, right, probably came up in all of your meetings, yeah? So it's a major issue. And the reality is that, central banks and regulators, we're not a stuffy bunch, right? We can absolutely play a role to facilitate transition. And a key component of that is making sure that the financial sector identifies and manages their environmental risks properly. And the reality is that financial institutions absolutely need to be concerned about their environmental risks, right? So not just climate, but biodiversity loss, pollution, so many other factors, right? Because the reality is both physical and transition risks are significant, and they will impact, banks and other financial institutions, whether it's about their balance sheets or their portfolios, stranded assets, and so on. Now, if we know that, right, why isn't more done? And I think there are a number of challenges to Jan's question. There are a number of challenges that are kind of inherent in the problem that mean that banks and other financial institutions maybe either don't take action or more commonly don't take enough action. So let me lay some of these challenges out. I think first, the financial impact can seem very distant sometimes. So the average tenor of a bank loan is what? 3 to 5 years, right? And that's a far shorter horizon than 2050 or some of the timeframes that we're talking about with climate change. And even if the bank has identified transition risks or other longer term risks, banks sit there and say, hey, my portfolio is actually fairly diversified, right? So you sort of downplay the impact on yourself. The second challenge, measurement, is difficult. Right? The reality is, we're still trying to figure out how to measure the exact extent of our exposure or our vulnerability to climate issues. And it can be really difficult to identify how this change, this pivot that we all need to make will affect different parts of the economy, right? Can you imagine how hard it is for financial institutions? The third challenge, and this is a real one, right, is that in this space, first movers may seem disadvantaged. So, you want to be the forward-leaning bank that does the right thing. But at the same time, if not every bank is doing the same thing, and you're the one, with a very robust client engagement strategy, or you're asking a million questions, right? It can seem like the clients just run off somewhere else, right? So I think, there is this issue about a first mover disadvantage that we need to address. And finally, doing the right thing is actually a very nuanced thing in this space, and it can be easily misunderstood. Let me give you a simple example. If I'm a financial institution and I give a loan, right, or financing to a company in a high-emitting sector, but I'm giving them that loan so that they can try out new technology, try to be greener, right? The criticism that sometimes comes up is, hey, how could you possibly have financed that high-emitting, dirty, brown company, right? So that nuance of what I think needs to happen for transition, it doesn't lend itself very easily sometimes to social media and other publicity and NGO pressure. So that's something we need to watch as well. And financial institutions are absolutely terrified of being accused of greenwashing. I'm sure this came up in conversations this week as well, right? So how do you do that, right? How do we make sure that we have the data and the robust verification and measurement methods so that, right, an FI feels confident? So at the MAS, we've put out guidelines to try and give some guidance on how financial institutions should manage environmental risks. We've done this across banks, asset managers, and insurers. What have we picked up? Again, 3 things. First, our financial institutions, just here in Singapore, they have very varying, degrees of progress and development in this space. Some know a lot and are doing a lot, and for others, it's a bit of a new process, right? Second challenge, so much of what we expect of financial institutions in environmental risks is wrapped up in the real economy, right? It's sitting in companies that engage in coal or do industrials or paper or produce steel, right? So it's become challenging, right? Because it's not just a financial piece, like some of the challenges that I think Babak mentioned previously that we dealt with in earlier decades. It's a whole of economy piece. And thirdly, I think because this is so nascent, we're all still trying to figure it out globally, right? Regulators are trying to figure it out. But there are opportunities here as well. I don't want to go on, but just on the last point, since we're all figuring it out, we've seen really good collaboration globally. You know, the MES is fairly active on the NGFS, which is a group that sort of brings regulators together to discuss some of these supervisory issues. I think partners like the Toronto Centre play a key role in doing some of that, and it's been really good to see the collaboration there. I'll stop there, Jan.
Thanks, Gillian. And you know what, you got me at financial innovation, because that's absolutely the challenge that we've got with climate transition. U of T has a major project plan to get beyond net zero to a carbon sink. Who knew University of Toronto is the third largest public sector emitter in the province of Ontario? The challenge, however, fabulous plan to get there, but universities aren't typically funded for doing climate transition projects. So financial innovation has been critical to move that forward. Now thinking of forward-thinking banks, here we go, RBC. Alvin, got some questions for you. You've got 15 years of experience, financial industry, economic analysis, portfolio management, investment strategy, based here in Singapore. In your opinion, what are the major consequences of those global challenges I spoke about in my opening on the Asian markets?
Well, I think three comes to mind easily. So first is that the intensifying globalization of the past several decades has driven quite a heightened correlation across global markets, and Asian markets are no exception. So we have seen, for example, tremendous volatility pickup in financial markets around the world, and in Asia, in the currency markets, for example. Huge movements, during the pandemic and its aftermath. And that's one part of it. And the other part is, of course, the rise of China with both positive and negative consequences. Of course, a more prosperous China is a net benefit to Asia overall. But more recently, we've also seen how China's growing economic and financial clout has seen some of its economic difficulties in recent years translate to the local markets in Asia. China's economy, of course, has suffered on the back of the property sector downturn recently and the COVID, the pandemic-related problems. And the third one is a related one, I suppose, is the intensifying, deepening U.S.-China geopolitical rivalry. So this, of course, hangs as a sort of Damocles over the Asian markets, and witness the regular speculation, regular commentary about the durability of the Hong Kong dollar peg, for example. So all these increasing interrelatedness among financial markets, globally, regionally, is something that market participants and policymakers need to be highly aware of, highly sensitive to, because financial shocks from one part of the world is easily transmitted, across to another part of the world in seconds, nowadays. So it's something that investors and policymakers, have to have a deep understanding of, and be mindful of these interrelatedness among markets.
Well, thanks for that. And again, I'm just reflecting, and a lot of discussions this week as well as last week about the geopolitical tension between China and the US. And then you flip a switch back to the pandemic, and if it had not been for the amazing global collaboration, where would we be on vaccines and solutions and getting this under control? And so, Joe, I want to get your thoughts. I mean, universities are multilateral actors. You play important roles in contributing to some of that research and collaboration globally to find these solutions to these critical global challenges. Yet, there's also the struggle. How do you balance that important work to ensure national security and global collaboration? So, where's the sweet spot in all this?
Terrific, thank you. First of all, Jan, you're not allowed to tell everyone that U of T is the third largest GHG emitter in the public sector in Ontario. That's for us to tell everyone that we're the third largest GHG emitter in Ontario. But thank you for the shout out in terms of the work that's being done on campus to rectify that. Second, I just want to also thank Paul and Jeff, as well as your terrific teams, for putting on just an amazing, amazing conference and convening a really important set of conversations. So really gratified and really thankful for that. Let me begin actually by just sharing a data point with you that motivates me in my work as the Vice President International at U of T. 50% of all of our research output involves an international co-author. 40% of that involves a co-author at an institution in a lower middle income country. The vast majority of those are here in Asia. So the integration of universities into a multilateral system, particularly and especially here in Asia, actually, has been a long-standing strategic play on the part of universities. And so while I appreciate and welcome the real enthusiasm that people have shown over the last 2 days about how Canada, has an important role to play in this region, and we have to establish partnerships, it does make me think, we've been here for a long time. This struck me as a conversation we were having in the 80s and 90s as it's been raised, right? But in fact, universities have been here in a long time. So actually I want to make the case that universities ought to be seen as a leading edge asset as opposed to a trailing edge that needs nudging or an enthusiastic embrace. But rather, a leading edge that could really benefit from some of the extraordinary tailwinds that we've generated over the last couple of days. So let me just give you a couple examples. One is, I think that universities are an incredibly important actor in terms of multilateral circuitry. One of the nice things about being in the academy is that in some ways we're insulated from a lot of the high politics. And a lot of the circuitry that's already being established has long been established through relationships that have been established between co-authors and co-PIs, principal investigators, and so forth, right? One of the things that I have learned as an academic leader is that institutions don't create partnerships. The partnerships are actually between individuals. And these individuals, and I heard a couple days ago talking about Asia not as a region per se or as a diplomatic construct, but rather it's people. And so these collaborations are actually being established between people. Those relationships inculcate trust. And this is why we often refer to universities and refer to one another as trusted partners. And so while the world is navigating the rocky shoals of a very tense geopolitical situation, it's incredibly important that universities play this leading edge role in making sure the circuitry is still there so that when things become less rocky, that we're not caught on our back foot, that the relationships already exist and the trusted partnerships are already there. Which of course brings us to the question of China, and it's already raised. I mean, this is in many ways the elephant in the room, and as it's been noted by some of my colleagues, I did an interview with Matt Galloway last week on The Current. I love listening to Matt Galloway. I really dread having to be interviewed by Matt Galloway. But we got on the question of research security. And I think we need to make very clear, and I'm not speaking on behalf of other universities, but certainly my own, that universities are in no way looking to be engaged in research that pose any national security threat. To suggest otherwise is absolutely ludicrous. But to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to forego the extensive collaborations that are going on in areas that are not threats to national security, I think is something that we need to be very careful about. Because there's extraordinary work that's being done in areas of shared interest: climate change, healthy aging, intercultural learning, inclusivity, and so forth. These are areas in which we are learning from one another. And these are areas that will benefit not only Canadians, but ultimately the entire world. So when we think about universities now as a strategic asset, it's about laying down that circuitry. It's about ensuring that these collaborative linkages are there and that they're enduring. But I want to add one last thing. Universities have a lot to contribute, particularly as we think about more global engagement than ever before. when it comes to the most pressing challenges of the day, we call them the Sustainable Development Goals now. These are a set of goals we're unlikely to reach. And I'll tell you one of the reasons why it's unlikely to be reached. It's because when we were conceiving the SDGs back in 2012 or so, before they were launched in 2015, it's always struck me that one of the most sort of conspicuous omissions of those at the table were the universities. We had a set of goals that the entire world agreed upon. In cartographical terms, as though we had baseline and we had a destination point, but no sense of how we were actually going to get there. And it's always struck me that universities actually had an important role to play in terms of the theories we develop, in terms of the technologies that are being developed in our lab, and most importantly, as the previous speaker was so incredibly inspiring, Moshe, talking about his experience as a young architect. The future leaders are in our classrooms now. University of Toronto has 95,000 students. So as we and as Moshe was saying, you know, they're the ones, as he was at the age of 29, the leading edge. So when we think about the post-2030 agenda, which is going to be centered in this region of the world, it's imperative that universities be at the table, not only for the know-how and the knowledge that we bring, but because the next generation of leaders are in our classrooms now. So again, I just want to make that case that we're not just you know, an asset to be brought out once in a while, to provide a little advice once in a while with our knowledge. We're actually a leading edge asset in terms of restructuring for a better, more prosperous world.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Jim. And I think that echoes what Joshua was saying in the earlier panel as well about, you know, responsible AI being an emerging theme as well, and there's a huge role that needs to be played here. Babak, Toronto Centre, 25th anniversary, quarter-century capacity building. What's the strategy for what's next?
Jan, I'm not 25 years old.
26, 27?
No, I want to actually thank you for that, and I will get to that question. Joe, I want to agree with you about the role of universities. In fact, one of our founders was the Schulich School of Business. And back 25 years ago, we learned a lot from them about how to put together case studies, which we turned into actionable programs for supervisors and regulators who come to our programs and are not exposed to academic theory, but they actually learn real-life case studies of a failure of a financial institution or successes elsewhere and run through those simulations to learn about that. I mean, that's what we really focus on. And the other founders, I mean, Jeff is here. Jeff was one of the very first participants in one of our programs, was the Government of Canada and the World Bank, right? And then as we look to the future, Jeff, I want to actually, hopefully you'll be pleased to know that really we haven't changed the modality of our teaching. We're just applying it to the real world. For example, we talked a lot about multilateral challenges. We talked today, one of the professors talked about I guess today or tomorrow is the anniversary of the Russian invasion. Well, you know, we've been living that. We provided support to the National Bank of Ukraine. We were there, we helped them, and we were doing the teaching to them when their staff were out in the field fighting and coming back during the different secondments. We partnered with our partners in the Central Bank of Sweden, Canada Deposit Insurance Corporation, to help them navigate through that financial crisis. And we will continue to do that in governance. They need a lot of support for governance after the war is over. We will be there. Indo-Pacific is like a term that's, you know, it's a wonderful term, but, you know, it's not new for us. We have a very active profile in Indo-Pacific, so that's the second part of our strategy. Right now, in addition to the ASEAN countries in which we are working with, or associations of supervisors that we train, we also have a very active file in upgrading the Insurance Regulatory Authority of India's risk-based supervision. We helped Pakistan's state bank in their crisis preparedness, Nepal. So we're here in the region very active. We have an active profile in sub-Saharan Africa too, and so in Latin America. And I should mention Colombia and Costa Rica credited the training they received from us for them becoming members of the OECD. That was a crowning achievement for us, and we want to be able to duplicate that in other parts of the world as well. And you know, Canada's commitment to international development, which is the envelope in which we work, is also related to the SDGs, as Joe talked about. So we have an active profile there for financial regulators and supervisors, climate risk being one, although we don't really see it as an SDG issue, it's really a financial stability point as well. And Gillian and I were talking about the fact that nobody taught supervisors how to deal with this issue. There was no blueprint, nothing. We really had to put it together. And Toronto Centre, I'm very proud to say, was the very first organization that started training financial sector regulators and supervisors on climate risk supervision. We have toolkits, we have on climate risk and biodiversity. We were doing this work before the Network for Greening the Financial System, composed of central bankers, got involved, and we are collaborating with them as well. And the other thing that I want to mention here is that food security is becoming a very important issue. Supervisors and regulators cannot solve that problem, but they're part of the critical part of that. You know, when you go to IKEA, you buy something and then there's a little wrench missing. We are that little wrench missing because of crop insurance and other activities that we can do, both in terms of mitigating risk to the financial institutions and helping the smallhold farmers. And financial literacy is the nexus of financial literacy, financial inclusion, and also with climate risk. So we are going to play an active role in there. And the very final thing I want to mention is that we are the first organization to offer, Jan, a certificate for financial supervision designation, CFS. We have been having conversations with the CFA Institute. We are not modeling it after them, but we're using it as an inspiration. And we are putting a lot of resources into that. And it's a program that is very much grade-oriented, so you don't get the grade, you don't pass the exam, you fail. But we want to bring a sense of pride to this profession where it's very thankless. A lot of supervisors, including some in this region, have no legal protection. I spent a lot of my time a couple of weeks ago trying to help a former superintendent of a financial institutions that was being audited through some kind of a political kangaroo court on how they need to get out of that. So, you know, here we're dealing with a lot of different issues that regulators are under fire, and Toronto Centre is there to help them. So think of us as supervisors without borders. My task today after Moshe Safdie was to make supervision sexy for you, so I'm doing my best. Thank you.
Thanks, Babak. And I was just going to say, at some point, I'd like to talk to you and Gillian about cyber risk, because that's been a big topic of discussion in Auckland last week. Gillian, let's stick with the green theme. Singapore, major international financial center in Asia. The Monetary Authority of Singapore has a green finance action plan. This has been in place since 2019. Now, I'm looking at the clock. We've got about 25 minutes. What I'd like to do is if we could trouble you for kind of a 2 to 3 minute, and I'll go back to the other two speakers because I do want to allow time for questions. So my questions to you: what are the main pillars of the Green Finance Action Plan? What else can be done to support our transition?
I'm going to annoy Jan by not answering the question, because what I was really taken with Joe's points about multilateralism, and I think the reality is we've seen it come under threat. Right? We've seen it come under threat. It's complex, right? For reasons that are well out of my wheelhouse and probably, should be directed that way. But what I do see is that while there is some reluctance and some pullback maybe at the sort of big multilateral platforms, right, of the past, what we do see is this rise in sort of issue-specific platforms to solve the pressing problems of the day. And I think climate is going to be one of those issues alongside food security, water insecurity, and so on. So with that, let me make a quick pitch for why Canada should care about Asia and engage with us on this particular issue. I think first, Asia is simply not on a trajectory to achieve net zero by 2050. We're just not investing enough, right? And it's not just an Asian issue, it's a global issue, right? McKinsey has worked out that what the world needs to transition to net zero is $9 trillion per year for the next 30 years, right? And we're about 3.5 trillion short each and every year. So that's the first data point. The second data point is that Asia is where the climate battle will be won or lost. We account for half of the world's population. We account for about half of the world's global greenhouse gas emissions, right? So this is what's needed, and the reality is that fossil fuels continue to account for 80% of our energy generation, and 70% of our electricity generation. So the data point that you should take from that is that if we're serious about climate change, we have to be serious about coal. And the third and last point is that we will need transition finance for Asia, and you guys can help with that, right? When we developed the Green Finance Action Plan back in 2019, we were really fixated on green activities and making sure finance could go there. But guess what? Green makes up 8% of the global economy, right? So who's financing the remaining 92%? So this is, the areas that we're looking at. And if you ask, Jen asked about our priorities. There are a few, but we don't have much time, so I'll just hone in on some key themes. I think the first is data, definitions, and disclosure, right? We absolutely need, as a community, a global community, to come together and agree on clear definitions of what is green and what is transition, right? So in Singapore and in ASEAN, the region, we're rolling out taxonomies that have a transition category, unlike the EU taxonomy, right? And this transition category is for activities that may not be fully 1.5 degree aligned right now because the technology is not available or it's uncertain, but it's there. And we're making a statement to say, these guys, they need to be financed as well, right? And I think the more global support we can get for that concept, the concept that finance needs to go in to support companies to move to a greener pathway, the better the outcome for the world will be. The second priority is blended finance. I mentioned just now the huge financing gap that we have, right? $3.5 trillion a year for the next 30 years. The reality is there's a lot of private capital out there, right? But the risk-return parameters just don't work. Right? So we absolutely need to do better as a system globally and regionally to de-risk projects, right? To be able to attract private capital to come in a way that makes sense for them. So, whether it's about sort of, governments working together with industry, with academia, with experts to put together infrastructure platforms or infrastructure financing platforms to do the financing at scale that we need, right? Whether it's about capacity building, right? What Joe's saying, we rely heavily on our centers of excellence that we set up. I flew out to London, I spoke to Cambridge, I spoke to Oxford, LSE, Imperial, various other schools, right? I didn't make it to Toronto, maybe, because the Brits caught me in London, but next time I'll go there, right? But they've been hugely valuable partners to us alongside Toronto Centre and others in terms of quickly enabling us to upskill, right? What do a bunch of bankers know about transition pathways or sectoral pathways or steel, right? And the academic community has been instrumental in helping us gear up. So that's to Joe's point. And so that's really it, Jen. I think it's about finance, it's about data, standards, and finally capacity building and building the talent that we need to support all of this.
Thanks, Gillian. And Joe, since I'm already in trouble on U of T and the climate transition plan, let me just say the financial innovation for them as they're moving forward on their project came from Canada Infrastructure Bank, that first tranche of financing, and now the private sector and other markets can come in. Speaking of money, Alvin, Asia's currency values and markets, what are the effects of the currency fluctuations having in near to medium term? How is that creating economic pressure points in the region?
Right, so first of all, to upstage Gillian, I was in Toronto and Montreal last week, in fact. But back to your question, Janet. The last 2 years actually have been quite challenging for the economies and policymakers in the region. And it's partly because of the currency fluctuations. So, global commodity prices, whether in oil, gas, wheat, iron ore, soybeans, they are largely denominated in US dollars. So, of course, when the domestic exchange rates weaken vis-a-vis the US dollars, the transmission of the inflation shocks to the local economy is magnified, of course, in domestic currency terms. And so the rapidly rising US dollars, in 2021 through much of last year, exacerbated the inflation pressures felt in the region. And related to that is that actually, globally, I spoke earlier about, correlations across financial markets. Globally, interest rates are actually more correlated than equity markets. So we have, of course, seen higher interest rates. I mean, in Canada, you've seen higher interest rates. In the United States, you've seen higher interest rates, right across the world. And it's no different here. In Singapore, for example, mortgage rates in Singapore have actually tripled in the past 2 years. So the high inflation across the world, weakening currencies have resulted in direct negative effects across the domestic economies in the region. However, that said, more recently we have seen some easing of the currency pressures. So the US dollar appears to have turned starting in October of last year. So that's eased some of the pressures. But of course, high interest rates are still with us, and it does seem it will be with us for somewhat longer. So that will continue to exert an impact on the economies of the region. Now, that said, and policymakers in Asia are always mindful of the 1997 financial crisis. And Babak was mentioning, Toronto Centre was involved in the aftermath of the crisis. Even though the crisis happened, over a generation ago, it still looms large in the region. And so because of that, most countries in the region have built up significant foreign reserves as an insurance against a recurrence of this crisis. And also, policymakers in the region do keep quite a close eye on the external deficits, the current account deficits, and try to prevent, again, a recurrence of the crisis that was caused by widening current account deficits and thereby rising foreign debt. And so because of this caution on the part of policymakers, I would say that Asian emerging markets generally have been well positioned among global emerging markets in facing the problems caused by the pandemic and its aftermath.
Thanks for that. I'm going to jump right over to Joe, because I do want to allow time for questions. Joe has got the perfect question to lead us into the Q&A. So we'll probably have time for 2 or 3 questions from the audience. So get ready, and I'll look to APF to let us know how we track down your questions. Joe, you have the final say in this part of the program. Can you elaborate on U of T's approach to the new Indo-Pacific strategy, and what ways can you diversify the region's collaborations and interests going forward on behalf of U of T?
Okay, thanks. I don't know if I'll do it so U of T specific, I think, but
well, that's okay. Gillian made her own question anyway.
Yeah,
So you
no.
okay.
I'll draw on that though. So, first of all, I have to say, as a scholar, as a researcher who's spent my entire career working on and in this region, it was really exciting to see the government of Canada put together an Indo-Pacific strategy. I think it was just one of these openings that just allow for a whole new vista of opportunities. But there are a couple things that I worry about a little bit in terms of framing, and these are things I hope that other university leaders, as well as those in this august community, will also consider. The first is that I think in some ways, the Indo-Pacific strategy has been understood as a diversification strategy in order to mitigate risk. And I worry a little, and it's never been explicitly said, but it's been implied that one ought to take this Indo-Pacific strategy and really think about it as a risk mitigation strategy or approach. I'd like to think of it more actually as a generation of opportunity, right? And it's just a slight change in the mindset, but I think the implications actually can be quite profound in terms of the kind of work that we can be doing in the region. The second thing then that I want to say is in terms of the diversity, is really to appreciate the extraordinary diversity of what this region is all about. So I do worry sometimes that we take a kind of broad brush to the Indo-Pacific region as though it's monolithic, it's homogenous, and it doesn't lack an extraordinary, frankly, internal diversity. And again, I think universities are well positioned to really appreciate that, provided that's really built in to our a priori mindset. I mean, just in the last couple of days, right? And you know, I've spent my career here, but just in the last couple of days, I learned from someone that, you know, in Thailand, international students from Thailand looking to study in Canada are less attracted to the postgraduate work permit stream because, in fact, they want to return to Thailand. And so the way in which we might look to recruit international students from Thailand will be vastly different than how we recruit, for instance, students from India, for which the postgraduate work permit stream is really critical, right? I was talking to Vivek yesterday, and we were remarking on how important Indonesia is with regards to mangrove conservation and the development of carbon credit markets, right? And again, that's a different type of engagement we might have with a specific region. I mean, in my own work in terms of industrial policy, you know, you have a chaebol-dominated sector in Korea in which you have large conglomerate firms, and so industry-sponsored research and collaboration with Korean firms is vastly different than plugging into supply chains and the value chain in Taiwan, which is, notwithstanding TSMC, largely based on small and medium-sized enterprises. So there's this extraordinary diversity in the region that I think, again, as universities and as other stakeholders, we really need to be cognizant of. So what are the implications of that? I mean, first of all, we need to be investing in our knowledge of the region and the specific context within the region. And so our international strategic plan at U of T is really about recognizing that an international strategic plan can't be implemented in toto as though one size fits all. And I was so impressed with the extraordinary leaders of the think tanks in Canada at the session this morning. Like, those think tanks need to be invested in. That's where the knowledge is going to be generated in terms of how we strategically approach this particular region. We need to be thinking about how do we coordinate across universities so that we're actually developing complementary centers of excellence in terms of how we engage the region, in terms of different sources of expertise. We need to coordinate, for instance, in terms of how we collaborate with, not isolate China, and collaborate productively and safely with partners, individuals, and institutions in China. What this all means in the end is that there is an Indo-Pacific strategy, but we need to develop strategies. And, you know, at the University of Toronto, we just unveiled our current iteration of the International Strategic Plan. And my first instinct when we were devising this was, we'll just do everything. And I had to be reminded by, you know, our AVPs that, no, actually what goes into a strategic plan are the choices of those things that you can't do and that you won't do. And that's the harder question, right? So that's the question that I pose to colleagues here as we think about how we engage strategically this region. There's a menu of options that the Indo-Pacific strategy offers us, right? But this is actually a menu that now we have to say, we'll take a little bit of this, we'll take a little bit of this, we're really good at this, and we won't do X, Y, and Z. And that's what goes into a strategic plan. So I welcome those kinds of conversations across the university sector because, again, if we are to truly be a leading edge asset, we have to make those difficult choices. Thanks.
Jen, just to say one thing, which is while you're devising that strategic plan, that nuanced, individualized strategic plan, as the single representative of the Singapore government here, I just want to say that, you know, we're happy to partner with you on that journey, right? And I mean, at least in the financial sector, the RBC and, you know, other Canadian players are in Singapore precisely because they see us as a simple gateway from which to sort of access the broader Asia and understand Asia better. So that was a little plug there that I just had to fit in. Thank you, Jen.
You're such a good Canadian. Thank you. I couldn't agree more, Joe. And I think at ABLAC, the Canadian business leaders that were in the room, this is not a diversification strategy. This is where the future of their businesses lie. This is economic growth and competitiveness for Canada. It's the future of our country. So let's not think of this as toe in the water. We've got to be all in. And people have heard me ranting for the last couple of days about focus and picking our spots. Questions from you. We've had some interesting discussion. I'd like to pose the question to you to bring back questions to us that help us maybe pick some spots from what you've heard today. Where are the areas we can lean in? What are the things you'd like to explore in terms of helping us define how do we become very focused on positioning Canada as a powerhouse here in Asia by bringing our best to this region with the challenges you've just heard. So if I could look to Jordan or somebody to see how we're going to pick up questions. If you want to put up your hand, I assume we've got mics in the room. Great, thank you. Could you introduce yourself?
No, I'm just saying there are 3 mics, one.
Okay, that's Jordan. Hi, Jordan. Okay, Jeff Nankerville has a question. Jeff, you can use mine. Yeah.
Thanks for an extraordinarily rich panel. You know what I'm hearing, and I'm hearing it in this session, is about, and particularly Joe, what you were talking about. You know, we're talking a lot about what Canada can offer to these people, those people, and so on. Of course, I mean, a huge part of all of this is like we're coming. You know, say people are coming from Canada to Asia, to Southeast Asia, to Singapore because of what is offered here for Canada and for Canadians. And I think that's really important to emphasize. So it could still be about Canadians, you know, coming here, but they're coming here not to like give something or sell something. In many cases, they're coming here to get something. And when we talk about the importance of Asia to Canada, it's really, you know, it's not about selling more stuff, you know, from Canada to Asia. It's that there is so much on offer in Asia to benefit Canada. So my question is, if you have suggestions, you know, we're talking about how to make Canada better known in Southeast Asia, and that's a major focus for us. But how do we what are some practical things to make Southeast Asia better known in Canada? Because the reverse problem does exist. It's the part of the world, I think, that is probably least well understood in many parts of Canada. And you know, I think you may have some suggestions in that area. Thanks.
So that's an excellent question. So Jeff, just talking about Southeast Asia here, I mean, I don't think a lot of Canadians necessarily may know that the ASEAN region is probably, I don't know, 4th, 5th largest trading area in the world with 700, 800 million people. I mean, we can help to try to explain some of that, or there's many others like that, but I mean, just that kind of an education by itself is going to be remarkably important. In our case, we have trained over 20,000 regulators and supervisors since our inception. About a third of them are from Asia and a good subset from the ASEAN area. So there's a lot of interconnections that you can think of and be aware of, but sometimes we feel, Jeff, like that kid in the school that has the answers, raises their hand, and no one really calls on. So let's look at others who actually are in the area, are in the region, right? And I mean, just leveraging each other's support. We don't need to always reinvent the wheel every single time, right? So more to your point. Thanks.
Okay. I'm looking at time. Gillian?
No, I just wanted to say, I think infrastructure is another key area. Your minister, is her name Mary Ng? Yeah. So she's come out quite a few times, and I think her team does amazing work with Infrastructure Asia, which is this outfit that we've set up in Singapore precisely to sort of connect, folks in the broader sort of economy with Asian opportunities for infrastructure development. And I think that would be a great area for Canadians to think about as well.
Okay, we've got 3 minutes left on the clock. I'm not seeing anyone at the mic, so here's what I'm going to suggest. I'm going to ask, okay. Question over here.
Just a quick question about democracies and what perhaps we can learn from the democracy of Singapore. I lived here during the 90s when William Safire was all over Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, unrelenting. And I have a son who just graduated from the University of Maryland, so I spend time in Washington, and I'm obviously here in Singapore. I'm a lot more comfortable here than I am when I'm visiting my son in Washington, D.C. I think it's time that we start looking at other models of democracy and perhaps pick up some of those strengths. Perhaps somebody on the panel can comment on that.
Joe, did you want to take that one? Gillian, please. Thanks.
No, I mean, thank you. No, I just wanted to say that, I mean, just speaking from sort of, the areas that I've been focusing on for the last year or so, what's been really effective is when governments create a conducive ecosystem and environment for public and private collaboration to flourish, right? And there are many elements to that, including making sure we share the data, making sure that communication channels are open, making sure that the issues that we're trying to solve together are squarely put on the table, and creating platforms for that collaboration to happen. So I think for Singapore, and we talk about the sort of Singapore story and the recipe for success, I just want to flag that as something that I personally think is very helpful. And I'm sure many other jurisdictions, many other countries have platforms like that. But I think we really need to double down efforts on that front.
If I could just add to that, can I be an honorary Singaporean for a minute? What has always impressed me is the attention to social consequences here, and the attention to where's the economy going, where do skills need to be, how do they create the right conditions, the housing discussion we had before. If we're addressing social consequences, it's incredible what can be achieved. So I would say that's what's always struck me about Singapore. Okay, we've got 1 minute and 10 seconds, 8 seconds. I need 5 seconds to wrap up, so I'm going to ask you guys within 1 minute, help us answer Joe's question. What are the 2 things Canada should think about against the backdrop of challenges we've just discussed as we think about getting active the Indo-Pacific strategy? Joe, let's start with you. You almost put your mic down. That's all.
I asked the question, so I was actually just going to take some notes. No, look, it's all about continued engagement, and it's a recognition that it's a continued engagement. This is not new, and I think we need to, and I'm speaking here to colleagues in the university sector, to approach with the kind of confidence that, in fact, this is an area of the world in which we've been deeply engaged with for a long time. That mindset is going to be really important, and corral the kind of expertise that you have within your institutions in order to make these kinds of strategic choices. I will say one area that I would love to see continue to be a priority is the movement of students. And this is, ways in which we can reduce the transaction costs of the mobility of students. Canadian students spending time here, Asian students spending time at our institutions. And so by reduction of transaction costs, I mean everything from study permits and ensuring that those can be processed quickly. This is a huge reputational risk for brand Canada, and we're seeing it in our application numbers, to scholarships and bursaries to make sure that these kinds of experiential learning opportunities are accessible and inclusive. And it's through that, actually, Jeff, that I think that we that's a tremendous asset to move back and forth between these 2 regions. That's a great way to get to know Southeast Asia better, and for Southeast Asia to get to know Canada better.
Okay, and I apologize to the panelists. Babak,
Yeah.
we're going to let you have the final
Thanks.
word.
I mean, it's a hard act to follow after Joe, but as a proud naturalized Canadian, I can tell you that what the world needs is technical capacity building, local capacity building, building strong institutions by Canada. We have no colonial agenda. We have no imperial agenda. We're multilateral. I'm not talking about us. I'm talking about the way Canadians approach things. Let's build on that. That's what they're looking for. We spend a lot of time talking about values sometimes. Those are important. They have a role. But is that building of institutions, building of governance, that's what the world is looking at us, and we actually have the secret recipe there, and we can make a contribution.
Thanks for that. So the Indo-Pacific strategy, it's an incredible catalyst for Canada. We have the potential to establish Canada as a global powerhouse. The secret sauce, from talking to business leaders, from my time leading businesses in Asia, is where we can bring solutions that the market is seeking. And so against the backdrop of this conversation today, you've heard about some of the complexity of the environment we have, but there's also tremendous opportunity. Capacity building, energy tech, ag tech, educational collaboration, research collaboration, so much that we can be doing and bringing to the table. So let's continue to figure out which lanes we're going to play in and lean in really hard. I want to thank the amazing panelists.
Thank you, Jan.
Thank you. And Gillian, as an honorary Canadian, I just need to let you know it's tax filing season in Canada, so we'll talk to you about that a little later. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon. I'll turn it back to Kevin.